I want you to imagine something for me. Imagine finding out that the man you built your whole life around had been lying to your face for 11 months. Not lying with words. Lying with silence. Lying with a smile at breakfast. Lying with a kiss goodnight. Now imagine you find out, and you don't say a single word. You don't cry in front of him. You don't scream. You don't throw his things on the lawn like people do in the movies. Instead, you smile back. You kiss him goodnight, too. And every single day after that, you plan. This is my story. My name doesn't matter right now. You can call me Claire, because that's close enough to who I was before all of this happened. What matters is what I did, and what it taught me about the quiet kind of strength that nobody talks about enough. Before I tell you about the betrayal, I need you to understand what we had. Because if you don't understand what I lost, you won't understand what it cost him to take it from me. Daniel and I met when we were 24. I was working at a small marketing firm downtown, exhausted, underpaid, and still hopeful about life in the way you only are before it really tests you. He was finishing his MBA, funny in that dry, understated way, and he had this habit of remembering small details about people. What coffee you liked, what your dog's name was, what movie made you cry as a kid. I didn't know yet that noticing details was also what would help me catch him years later. We dated for 3 years before he proposed. It wasn't some extravagant, rehearsed moment. We were sitting on the floor of our first apartment, unpacking boxes, and he just looked at me and said, "I don't want to unpack another box in my life without you." I said yes before he even finished pulling the ring out of his jacket pocket. For the first 6 years of our marriage, I would have told you, without hesitation, that I married the right man. We built a life that looked, from the outside, like something people envied. A house with a small garden, 2 dogs, a group of friends who came over every other Friday for dinner. Careers that were finally paying off after years of grinding. We weren't rich, but we were comfortable, and more importantly, we were a team. I share all of this not to brag about what I had, but because I want you to sit with the contrast. I want you to feel, in your chest, what it means to build something for 9 years, and then discover it was hollow on the inside for the last one. Because here's the thing about betrayal. The real, quiet kind, not the dramatic kind you see in movies. It doesn't usually announce itself. It creeps in through small gaps. A phone turned face down on the table. A work trip that gets extended by 1 day. Sorry, I fell asleep, text sent at 1 a.m. Each one, alone, means nothing. Together, they become a pattern. And once you start noticing the pattern, you can never stop. I didn't notice right away. I want to be honest about that. For months, I explained away every small inconsistency. Because that's what you do when you love someone. You give them the benefit of the doubt, because the alternative is too painful to consider. But there's a moment, and if you've ever lived through something like this, you know exactly the moment I mean, where the doubt stops being something you can explain away, where your gut simply refuses to be quiet anymore. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday in March, at 9:47 p.m., when Daniel's phone lit up on the kitchen counter while he was in the shower. I wasn't trying to snoop. I want to be clear about that, because I know some of you are already judging me for what happens next. I was just wiping down the counter, and the screen lit up with a name I didn't recognize, Mel W., and a message preview that made my stomach drop before my brain even fully processed the words. It said, "Can't stop thinking about last night. You made me feel like myself again." I stood there in my kitchen, dish towel still in my hand, and I felt something inside me go very, very still. Not angry yet. Not sad yet. Just still. Like the moment right before a car crash, when everything slows down and you can see exactly what's about to happen, but you can't do anything to stop it. I didn't touch the phone. I put the towel down, I walked into the living room, and I sat on the couch, and I waited for him to come out of the shower. And here is where my story becomes different from most. Because when Daniel walked out 15 minutes later, humming some song from the radio, completely at ease, completely unaware that his entire world was about to change, I smiled at him. I said, "Hey, how was your day?" And he said, "Good, just tired," and kissed my forehead and went to check his phone. I watched him read that message. I watched his face flicker, just for half a second, with something like guilt, quickly replaced by a practiced calm. He typed something back, put the phone in his pocket, and asked what I wanted to watch on TV. That night, lying next to him in bed, listening to him fall asleep peacefully while my mind raced through 9 years of memories, I made a decision that would define the next 4 months of my life. I decided I would not confront him. Not yet. I decided that if he was going to lie to me with a straight face, I was going to learn everything, every name, every place, every detail, before I said a single word. Because I refused to let him control the narrative of how this ended. I refused to let him have the version of the story where he got to apologize his way out of it. Or worse, twist it around to make it seem like it was somehow my fault. I was going to find the truth. All of it. And then I was going to decide, on my own terms, what justice looked like. What I didn't know yet was just how deep this went. Or how many people had been lying to me. Not just Daniel. That's coming up in the next part of this story. But first, I need to take you back to the beginning of that year, to the small signs I missed, the ones that, looking back now, were screaming at me the whole time. Betrayal rarely starts with a bang. It starts with a whisper so quiet you convince yourself you imagined it. Looking back now, I can point to at least 6 moments in the 4 months before that Tuesday night that should have told me something was wrong. At the time, each one felt small enough to dismiss. Together, they painted a picture I simply refused to look at directly. The first crack appeared in November, 4 months earlier. Daniel's company had hired a new project coordinator named Melissa, Mel, as everyone called her. He mentioned her the way you mention any new coworker, in passing, over dinner. The new coordinator is sharp, he said. Keeps everyone on schedule for once. I nodded, barely registering the name, because why would I? People get new coworkers all the time. It's not a red flag. It's just life. The second crack came in December at the company holiday party. I remember Melissa specifically because she was warm and funny, and she complimented my dress, and I liked her instantly. I remember Daniel introducing us with a strange kind of formality, not cold, but careful, like he was reciting a line he'd rehearsed. Claire, this is Melissa, she just joined the team. Nothing wrong with that sentence. Except I noticed, months later, replaying it in my head, that he didn't put his hand on my back the way he usually did when introducing me to people. Small thing. Meaningless, unless you're looking for meaning, which at the time, I wasn't. The third crack was in January. Daniel started going to the gym more. Not unusual on its own. Lots of people make New Year's resolutions. But he also started caring more about what he wore to work. New shirts. A haircut he didn't need. Small changes in a person you've slept next to for 9 years are like changes in a room's lighting. You don't always notice them directly, but you feel that something is different. The fourth crack was a work trip in February. 3 days in Denver for a conference, which was normal. He traveled a few times a year for work. But this trip got extended by a day for a client dinner that ran long. And when he came home, he was distant for about 2 days before slowly returning to normal. I remember asking if everything was okay, and he said he was just tired from the trip. I believed him because I had no reason not to. The fifth crack was the phone. Around the same time as the Denver trip, Daniel started keeping his phone with him more consistently, bringing it into the bathroom, keeping it face down on the nightstand instead of the kitchen counter where it used to live overnight. I noticed this, and I even mentioned it once, lightly, almost as a joke. You're very attached to that phone lately. He laughed and said something about a stressful project at work needing constant emails. I let it go. The sixth crack, and the one that haunts me the most in hindsight, was a Sunday afternoon in early March, about 2 weeks before the towel and kitchen moment. We were at brunch with our friends, the same group we'd had dinner with for years, and someone mentioned Daniel's coworker, Melissa, in passing, saying they'd run into her at the grocery store. Daniel's reaction was almost imperceptible, a slight tightening around his eyes. A too quick change of subject. If I had been looking for it, I would have caught it immediately. But I wasn't looking. Why would I be looking for lies in a marriage I trusted completely? I share all 6 of these moments not because I want you to feel sorry for me for missing them. I've made peace with that. But because I want you to understand something important. Betrayal isn't usually a single moment of weakness. It's a slow accumulation of small choices, each one a little easier than the last, because the person doing the lying gets more practiced each time. By the time I found that message on his phone in March, Daniel wasn't a man who had made one mistake. He was a man who had been building an entire second life, quietly, methodically, for months, while I was folding his laundry and asking about his day and trusting him completely. That realization, once it settled in, changed something in me. It wasn't just anger at him. It was anger at myself, for for the version of me that had been so easy to deceive. And it was that anger, cold, focused, and patient, that became the foundation of everything I did next. Because here's what I decided, lying awake that first night after seeing the message. If Daniel had spent months building a secret life, I could spend a few months quietly dismantling it. Not through screaming, not through smashing his things or keying his car like people do when they let anger control them. Through something far more dangerous to a man like Daniel: information, patience, and silence. The next morning, I did something I had never done before in 9 years of marriage. I woke up early, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and started writing down everything. Every date, every strange behavior, every small detail I could remember from the past 4 months. I wasn't just processing my pain. I was building a timeline. I didn't know it yet, but I had just taken the first step of an investigation that would eventually expose far more than a simple affair. Because what I would discover over the following weeks wasn't just that my husband had cheated. It was that he had cheated with someone who had her own reasons for wanting to blow up both of our lives, and that the web of lies extended further than I ever could have imagined. If you've never had to become a detective in your own marriage, I hope you never have to learn how it feels. It is one of the strangest, loneliest experiences a person can go through. Sitting across the dinner table from someone, laughing at their jokes, while quietly building a case against them in your mind. I want to walk you through exactly how I gathered the truth, because I think there's something important in the method, not just the outcome. This wasn't about becoming paranoid or obsessive. It was about being deliberate. The first thing I did was stop reacting emotionally to anything Daniel said or did. This was, without question, the hardest part. Every fiber of my being wanted to confront him the morning after I saw that message. But I understood something crucial. The moment I confronted him, he would have the chance to control the story. He could delete evidence. He could lie convincingly, the way people do when they're caught off guard but still have room to maneuver. He could cry, apologize, promise it meant nothing, and some small, hopeful part of me might have believed him, because after 9 years, some part of me still wanted to believe in the man I married. So instead, I decided to become patient. Cold, deliberate patience. Over the next 3 weeks, I paid attention to everything without ever letting on that anything had changed. I noted which nights he said he was working late. I noted the exact wording he used for excuses, because liars, I learned, often reuse the same phrases without realizing it, like a script they've memorized. I noted his mood when he came home, and I noted, very specifically, which days he showered immediately after getting home from work, which was new behavior that had started, as far as I could tell, sometime in January. I also started keeping a small notebook, not on my phone, where he might see it, but a physical notebook I kept in my car. Every relevant detail went into that notebook the moment I had a private moment to write it down. The second thing I did was start looking, carefully and quietly, for opportunities to see his phone without him knowing. I'm not going to pretend this was some elaborate spy operation. It wasn't. Daniel, like most people who think they're being careful, was actually quite predictable. He used the same passcode for his phone that he'd used for years, our anniversary date, which, in a strange and painful irony, meant I was unlocking evidence of his betrayal using the date we promised to be faithful to each other. The first time I got into his phone, it was late at night, and he had fallen asleep on the couch after a few beers, phone still in his hand. My own heart was pounding so hard I was sure it would wake him. I gently slid the phone out of his loose grip, unlocked it, and went straight to his messages. What I found in the messages with Mel W. wasn't just a fling. It was a relationship with history, inside jokes, plans, and, most damning of all, a shared understanding of secrecy. There were messages about keeping this between us, about not wanting to hurt anyone, phrases that told me this wasn't a moment of weakness. This was a decision, repeated again and again, for months. I took photos of the messages with my own phone, careful to keep my phone's flash off, careful to scroll slowly, so I wouldn't accidentally send anything or trigger a notification on his end. I want to be honest with you, my hands were shaking the entire time. Not from fear of being caught, but from the physical sensation of watching your entire understanding of your life rewrite itself in real time. I found out Melissa wasn't just a coworker he'd started something with recently. Their messages went back nearly 11 months, starting, based on the timestamps, just 2 weeks after she joined his company. 11 months. Nearly a full year of my husband living a second life while I planned our future, defended him to my family when they made offhand jokes about long work hours, and told my closest friend just months earlier how lucky I felt to have married someone so trustworthy. I also discovered something else in those messages, something that would become crucial to the plan I eventually built. Melissa wasn't single. She was engaged to a man named Robert, who, based on the way she talked about him in her text to Daniel, had absolutely no idea what was happening either. This detail changed something in me, because now this wasn't just about my pain. There was another person out there, a man I'd never met, who was about to marry someone who was betraying him just as thoroughly as Daniel was betraying me. And in that moment, lying awake at 2 a.m. with my husband snoring peacefully beside me, I made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I wasn't just going to expose Daniel's betrayal. I was going to make sure the truth came out completely, for Robert's sake as much as my own. Because if there's one thing I believe deeply, it's this: the people being deceived deserve the truth, even when the truth is devastating. Especially when the truth is devastating. Living inside someone else's lie is its own kind of prison, and I refuse to let another person stay locked in one longer than they had to. Over the following 2 weeks, I gathered more. I found out where they met. A hotel about 20 minutes from Daniel's office. Always the same one. Always paid for on a card I didn't recognize, which told me he'd opened something separate from our shared accounts. I found receipts, buried in an email folder he apparently forgot existed on our shared cloud storage, for gifts I never received. A necklace, a weekend spa package, a bottle of wine from a vineyard we'd visited on our honeymoon, which stung in a way I can't fully describe. I found out, through a slip in one of their messages, that Melissa's fiancé Robert worked in finance, at a firm not far from where I worked myself. And slowly, over those 2 weeks, a plan started forming in my mind. Not a plan built from rage, but a plan built from precision. I wasn't going to scream. I wasn't going to cry in front of him. I was going to gather every piece of truth I could find, and then, when I was ready, I was going to make sure that truth was impossible for anyone to deny, ignore, or explain away. Daniel had spent 11 months building a lie so comfortable he'd forgotten to be careful. I was about to spend the next several weeks making sure that comfort became the very thing that exposed him. There's a particular kind of strength that nobody prepares you for. The strength it takes to keep smiling at someone while you're quietly deciding how their life is about to fall apart. I want to be honest with you about something. During those weeks of gathering evidence, there were nights I cried alone in the shower, letting the water cover the sound so Daniel wouldn't hear from the next room. There were mornings I had to remind myself to eat breakfast, because grief, even the kind that hasn't been spoken aloud yet, has a way of stealing your appetite. I was mourning a marriage that, to the outside world, still looked completely intact. But I never let him see it. Not once. I want to explain why, because I think this is the part of my story that people either deeply understand or deeply criticize, and I've made peace with both reactions. Some people, when they hear this part of my story, tell me I should have confronted him immediately. That staying silent was somehow dishonest, that I was playing games instead of communicating like an adult. I understand that perspective, and if you feel that way, I respect it. But I want you to consider something. Daniel had already made his choice. He had already decided, 11 months earlier, to lie to my face every single day. My silence wasn't the beginning of the dishonesty in our marriage, his was. I was simply refusing to let him control how the truth came out. There's also a more practical reason I stayed quiet. I am, by nature, a careful person. I don't make big decisions in anger. I've watched friends confront cheating partners in the heat of the moment, only to be manipulated back into the relationship through tears, promises, and grand gestures that lasted exactly as long as it took for the fear of consequences to fade. I refused to let that happen to me. I needed to know everything, not just enough to be angry, but enough to be absolutely certain of what I was dealing with, and to make sure that whatever decision I made afterward, I made with clear eyes and a clear plan. So I set 3 rules for myself during this period, and I want to share them, because I think they're useful for anyone who ever finds themselves in a similar situation. Rule 1. Never confront with incomplete information. Half of a truth gives the other person room to spin the rest. I needed the full picture before I said a single word. Rule 2. Never let your enemy know you're building a case against them. The moment Daniel suspected I knew, He would change his behavior, cover his tracks more carefully, and potentially destroy evidence I hadn't collected yet. My calm, loving behavior toward him during this period wasn't kindness. It was strategy. It kept him comfortable, and comfortable people are careless people. Rule 3. Decide what justice means to you before you act, not in the middle of acting. I spent long nights thinking about what I actually wanted the outcome to be. Did I want him to grovel? Did I want to save the marriage if he begged hard enough? Did I want to simply disappear from his life and let him figure out where I'd gone? I needed to know my own answer before I moved forward, because emotional decisions made in the heat of confrontation rarely serve us well in the long run. By the end of the 3rd week, I had made my decision. I did not want to save this marriage. Not because I stopped loving the version of Daniel I thought I married. I think, in some strange way, I still loved him, or at least the idea of him, the way you can grieve someone who is still alive. But because I understood something crucial, trust, once broken this thoroughly, this deliberately, over this long a period of time, cannot simply be rebuilt through apology. Daniel hadn't slipped once in a moment of weakness. He had made a choice, repeatedly, for nearly a year. Every single time he chose comfort and secrecy over honesty with me. I decided my justice would not be dramatic in the way movies show us. No yelling in restaurants. No smashing his car windows. No screaming matches in front of neighbors. My justice would be quiet, thorough, and undeniable. I wanted Daniel to lose the exact things he had been protecting through his lies, his comfortable double life, his reputation, and his ability to control the narrative. And I wanted Robert, Melissa's fiancé, the man who had no idea his future wife was living a double life too, to know the truth before he made the biggest mistake of his life by marrying her. Once I made this decision, everything shifted. I stopped feeling like a victim reacting to what was happening to me, and I started feeling like a strategist building toward an outcome. That shift, more than anything else, is what allowed me to keep smiling at Daniel across the dinner table for the following 6 weeks, without a single crack in my composure. I began the next phase of my plan on a rainy Thursday evening, sitting alone in my car in a grocery store parking lot, staring at a name and phone number I had found buried in Melissa's public social media profile, a phone number listed on an old post advertising a small side business she used to run. It was Robert's number. I had found it through one of Melissa's old friends who was tagged in a photo with him, and a bit of careful searching from there. I sat in that parking lot for almost 20 minutes before I put my phone away without calling. Not because I'd changed my mind, but because I knew that reaching out to Robert too early, before I had every piece of evidence organized and undeniable, would be a mistake. He deserved proof, not accusations. He deserved a level of certainty that would make it impossible for Melissa to talk her way out of it. So I drove home instead, walked in the door, and when Daniel asked how my day was, I told him it was fine, kissed him on the cheek, and started making dinner. Inside, I was already 3 steps ahead, building toward the moment when both of their comfortable lies would collapse at exactly the same time. If the previous weeks were about discovery, the next phase of my journey was about construction. I wasn't just collecting pain anymore. I was building a case, methodical, organized, and airtight, the kind of case that couldn't be explained away with a single tearful apology. I approached it the way I imagine a journalist approaches an investigation. Everything needed a source. Everything needed a timestamp. Everything needed to be backed up in more than one place, because I understood that if Daniel ever discovered what I was doing before I was ready, he might try to destroy the evidence, or worse, try to convince people that I was the unstable one, spinning a story to make himself the victim. The first thing I did was create a private cloud folder, completely separate from anything Daniel had access to, under an email address he didn't know existed. Inside that folder, I organized everything by category: message screenshots, organized by date, financial records, showing the hotel charges and gift purchases, a written timeline connecting the messages to the strange behaviors I had noticed months earlier, and a separate folder specifically dedicated to information about Melissa and Robert. The financial piece of the puzzle turned out to be more revealing than I expected. Daniel had opened a separate bank account roughly 10 months earlier, conveniently, about 1 month after his messages with Melissa began. He'd been depositing small amounts from his paycheck into it every month, amounts small enough that they wouldn't be obviously missing from our joint finances, but consistent enough to add up to a meaningful amount over time. I found the statements by accessing an old joint credit monitoring service we had both signed up for years earlier, which, thankfully, still tracked accounts linked to his social security number, even ones he thought were hidden. That account had paid for the hotel visits. It had paid for a necklace I found photographed in one of Melissa's social media posts, worn on a night out with friends, captioned with something about treating myself, when in reality, my husband had bought it for her with money quietly siphoned from what should have been our shared future. The next piece I built was a clearer picture of Melissa herself. I want to be careful here because I don't believe in tearing apart another woman's life out of spite, but I do believe the full truth matters, and the full truth involved a person who had also broken a serious commitment to someone else. Melissa had been engaged to Robert for just over 2 years. Their wedding, based on posts I found on a wedding planning app she'd used publicly, was scheduled for early June, less than 3 months away from when I discovered everything. I found photos of their engagement, their save-the-dates, even glimpses of their wedding registry. Robert looked, in every photo, genuinely happy. The kind of happy that comes from believing wholeheartedly in the life you're building with someone. I felt a strange, unexpected kinship with this man I had never met. We were both, without knowing it, standing on the edge of the same cliff, and only one of us knew it yet. The third piece I built was documentation of the actual affair timeline itself, matching Daniel's supposed late nights at work and conference trips against message timestamps and hotel charges. This was, without question, the most painful part of the process, because it forced me to relive every single lie he'd told me, one by one, now stripped of any ambiguity. The Denver conference in February hadn't been extended by a day because of a demanding client. It had been extended because Melissa had joined him there for an extra night, paid for out of that same secret account. By the end of the 5th week since my discovery, I had built a case that spanned nearly 40 pages of documentation, messages, financial records, photos, and a detailed timeline connecting every piece. But I want to pause here and share something important about this period, because I think it's the part of the story that surprised me the most. Building this case didn't just prepare me to confront Daniel. It changed how I saw myself. Somewhere in the process of documenting every lie, every secret payment, every carefully worded excuse, I stopped seeing myself as a woman who had been foolish enough not to notice her husband's betrayal for 11 months. I started seeing myself as someone capable of extraordinary patience, precision, and strength under pressure, someone who could hold immense pain quietly, without letting it destroy her ability to think clearly. That shift mattered more than I expected, because the next phase of my plan required a level of calm I wasn't sure I had in me before all of this started. It was time to reach out to Robert. I drafted the message to him more than a dozen times over the course of 3 days. I wanted it to be clear, respectful, and completely free of any accusatory tone toward him. He was, after all, an innocent person in all of this, just like me. I finally settled on a simple approach. I would reach out, introduce myself honestly, and offer to share what I had found, with no obligation on his part to believe me immediately. I sent the message on a Sunday evening, my hands shaking slightly as I hit send, fully aware that this single message would set in motion a chain of events I could no longer control. The message said, "Hi Robert, my name is Claire. I know this message will be strange and difficult to receive, but I have information about Melissa that I believe you deserve to know before your wedding. I'm not looking for anything from you except honesty in return. Please let me know if you're open to talking." I put my phone down after sending it and sat in silence for nearly 10 minutes, my heart pounding, wondering if he would respond at all, or if he would simply block my number and dismiss me as some kind of jealous stranger. 40 minutes later, my phone buzzed. His response was simple, and it broke my heart a little for him, even as it confirmed everything I already suspected. "What kind of information? Please, just tell me." That was the moment the second half of my plan truly began. I want to take a moment here to talk about Robert, because his part of this story matters just as much as my own, and because what happened over the following 2 weeks changed the shape of my entire plan. Robert and I spoke on the phone 3 days after his first response to my message. I remember being nervous before the call, unsure how to explain something so devastating to a complete stranger without sounding unhinged. But the moment he answered, I could hear it in his voice, that same quiet unease I recognized in myself weeks earlier. The unease of someone who already suspects something is wrong, but hasn't allowed themselves to look directly at it yet. I told him everything, calmly and factually. I didn't editorialize. I didn't tell him how to feel. I simply laid out the timeline. The messages, dated back nearly a year. The hotel visits, matched against trips he thought Melissa had taken for work. The necklace he had actually paid for himself, unknowingly, believing it was a gift she'd bought for herself with her own bonus. There was a long silence on the phone after I finished. Then Robert said something I will never forget. She told me 2 weeks ago that she needed space to figure some things out before the wedding. I thought she was just stressed about planning. I didn't think. He stopped himself, and I heard his voice crack slightly before he composed himself again. Over the next several days, Robert and I compared notes. And this is where the story took a turn I hadn't fully anticipated. Robert had noticed his own set of small inconsistencies over the past several months. Sudden changes in Melissa's work schedule, an increase in team-building trips that seemed oddly frequent, a new perfume she'd started wearing that he didn't recognize. Alone, none of it had been enough for him to suspect anything. Together, combined with what I had, it created an even fuller picture of just how deliberate this deception had been on both their parts. But here's the detail that changed everything. Robert discovered, going through some of his own shared accounts with Melissa out of a growing sense of unease, that she had also been quietly moving money, not just accepting gifts from Daniel, but actively pulling funds from a joint savings account she and Robert had been building for their wedding and future home. Small amounts, transferred to a separate account under her name alone. Over the same period, she'd been seeing my husband. This wasn't just an emotional betrayal anymore. This was financial deception on both sides. Daniel quietly funneling money into secrecy, and Melissa quietly pulling money out of a future she had already privately decided to abandon. I remember sitting with this information and feeling something shift inside me. Not more anger, exactly, because I don't think I had room for more anger at that point. It was something closer to clarity. This wasn't a story about one weak moment or one bad decision. This was a story about two people who had built an entire structure of deception around themselves, each one betraying someone who trusted them completely, each one making calculated decisions, week after week, month after month, to protect their own comfort at the expense of the people who loved them. Robert and I made a decision together during that second phone call, a decision that would shape the final phase of the plan. We agreed that neither of us wanted this handled through screaming matches or public confrontations that would only give Daniel and Melissa room to twist the narrative, to play the victim, to manipulate their way into sympathy. We wanted the truth to come out in a way that left absolutely no room for denial, no room for spin, and no room for them to control how anyone else perceived what had happened. So we built a plan together, one that would expose everything at once, in a way that would be undeniable, and more importantly, in a way that would let both of us walk away with our dignity intact while they were left facing the full, unavoidable truth of what they had done. The plan centered around a very simple, very human weakness that both Daniel and Melissa shared. They believed, completely, that they had gotten away with it. They believed their secrecy had worked. They believed their partners were still in the dark. And people who believe they've successfully deceived someone tend to become careless in one very specific way. They start planning their future together, out loud, in places they think are private. Robert had noticed that Melissa's team-building trips often lined up suspiciously with a recurring calendar event on her shared family calendar app. One she had forgotten was still shared with him from earlier in their relationship. That calendar showed something neither of us expected. A trip planned for the same weekend as what would have been her bridal shower, listed simply as Denver, work, but paid for, we discovered, through the very account she'd been secretly pulling from. Daniel and Melissa were planning to see each other again, just 10 days before I planned to act. This single detail became the centerpiece of the plan Robert and I built together. Instead of confronting them separately, in our own homes, on our own timelines, we decided to let their secret trip become the moment of exposure, a moment neither of them could spin, explain away, or escape from, because it would happen in real time, in a place they believed was completely private, with evidence that spoke for itself. I want to be honest with you. Building this plan with Robert, a man I had never met in person before all of this, formed an unexpected bond between us. We weren't just working together out of a desire for revenge. We were, in a strange way, protecting each other. Two strangers who had been betrayed by people we loved, choosing to face the truth together instead of alone. Neither of us knew yet just how much that decision would matter in the weeks that followed. Once Robert and I understood exactly when and where Daniel and Melissa planned to meet again, the final phase of the plan came together with a kind of quiet momentum. Every decision from this point forward was deliberate. Every step was designed to accomplish one specific goal, to make sure that when the truth came out, it came out completely, undeniably, and on our terms, not theirs. The first decision we made was about timing. Their trip to Denver was scheduled for a Friday through Sunday, using the same hotel Daniel had used during his earlier, extended conference. We decided we would not confront them during the trip itself. A hotel room confrontation, dramatic as it might sound, would only give them a private space to control the conversation, to comfort each other, to align their stories before facing anyone else. Instead, we decided the exposure needed to happen the moment they returned, publicly enough that neither of them could quietly manage the fallout behind closed doors, but not so publicly that it became a spectacle that embarrassed us more than it exposed them. We settled on Sunday evening, at the small gathering Daniel and I had already planned weeks earlier, a dinner with our closest friends, the same group we'd been having dinner with for years, scheduled long before any of this happened. It was, in a strange way, perfect. Daniel would be home from his work trip, just in time to attend, exhausted and unsuspecting, surrounded by people who knew him well enough that his reactions couldn't be dismissed as some kind of misunderstanding. Robert, for his part, decided he wanted to be there when Melissa returned home as well, though his approach would happen separately, privately, at their shared apartment, later that same evening. We coordinated our timing carefully. He would confront Melissa with the evidence roughly an hour after my own moment unfolded, ensuring that neither of them would have the chance to warn the other or align their explanations before facing the people they had betrayed. In the days leading up to that Sunday, I focused on two things: staying calm enough to maintain my normal routine with Daniel, and finalizing the documentation I planned to present. I printed physical copies of the key evidence, the most damning messages, the financial records showing the secret account, and a simple, clear timeline connecting everything. I didn't want this to be a screaming match built on accusations he could dismiss as exaggeration or misunderstanding. I wanted him looking at cold, printed proof, in his own handwriting adjacent digital trail, undeniable in black and white. I also made a decision that surprised even me when I first thought of it. I invited my sister, quietly, without telling her why, to the Sunday dinner as well. Not to embarrass Daniel further, but because I needed one person there who loved me unconditionally, who could be a steady presence for me in the room when everything unfolded. I didn't tell her what was coming. I simply asked her to come and to trust me. The Friday and Saturday Daniel was away felt strange in a way I hadn't expected. Our house, usually filled with the small sounds of two people coexisting, the TV in the background, the dog shuffling between rooms, the quiet clink of dishes, felt unusually silent. I spent those 2 days doing something I hadn't allowed myself to do in the previous 6 weeks. I let myself feel the full weight of what was about to happen. I cried, deeply and honestly, not performing calm for anyone. I allowed myself to grieve the version of my marriage I thought I had, before steeling myself for what I needed to do next. By Saturday night, I felt something shift inside me, a strange sense of readiness that replaced the anxious uncertainty I'd been carrying for weeks. I wasn't nervous anymore. I was focused. Sunday afternoon, Daniel came home from his trip in good spirits, kissing me hello, talking about how productive the extended conference had been, completely unaware that I already knew every detail of who he'd actually spent his weekend with. I helped him unpack, made him a cup of coffee, and reminded him gently that our friends were coming over for dinner in a few hours, exactly as planned. He showered, changed, and by 6 o'clock, our house was filled with the familiar sounds of our friend group arriving. Marcus and his wife Priya, our neighbors Tom and Lena, and my sister, who arrived last, giving me a curious look when she noticed the slight tension in my shoulders that I hadn't quite managed to hide. Dinner started normally. Laughter, small talk, the comfortable rhythm of people who had known each other for years. Daniel was relaxed, telling a story about a supposed mix-up at the conference hotel, completely unaware that every word out of his mouth was, to me, another confirmation of just how practiced his lying had become. I waited until dessert was served, until the wine had loosened everyone's mood just enough, until the moment felt right, not for drama, but for clarity. Then I stood up, walked to the small drawer in our kitchen sideboard where I had hidden the folder of evidence 3 days earlier, and I set it gently on the table in front of Daniel. I said, calmly, in a voice that surprised even me with how steady it was, "I think it's time everyone at this table knew the truth about your trip to Denver." The table went silent in a way I don't think I can fully describe. It wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of silence that has weight, that presses against your chest, that makes even the sound of a fork being set down feel deafening. Daniel looked at the folder, then at me, his expression shifting from confusion to something closer to dawning panic. "What is this?" he asked, forcing a small, nervous laugh, the kind people use when they're hoping desperately that they've misunderstood the situation. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I simply opened the folder and slid the first page across the table toward him. A printed screenshot of a message exchange dated nearly a year earlier. The very beginning of what he thought was a perfectly hidden relationship. "I know about Melissa," I said. "I've known for 6 weeks. I know about the hotel in Denver, the one you supposedly visited for the first time this weekend, except it's actually the 4th time you've been there with her. I know about the account you opened to pay for it. And I know she's engaged to a man named Robert, who is having this exact same conversation with her right now, at your apartment, with the same evidence. I want to be honest about what happened next, because it wasn't the clean, cinematic moment you might expect from a movie. Daniel didn't dramatically confess through tears, and he didn't storm out in anger either. Instead, he did something almost worse. He tried, for a brief, painful moment, to minimize it. "It's not what it looks like," he said, the oldest and least convincing sentence in the history of infidelity, before catching my expression and realizing immediately that this particular lie would not survive contact with the evidence in front of him. Around the table, our friends sat frozen, caught between shock and the instinct to look away from something so intensely private. My sister reached over and took my hand under the table, steady and silent, exactly the anchor I needed in that moment. Daniel flipped through a few more pages of the folder, the financial records, the timeline, a printed photo of the necklace he'd bought Melissa, worn in one of her public social media posts. I watched something in his face change as he realized, page by page, that there was no version of events he could spin his way out of. This wasn't a misunderstanding he could talk his way through. This was a documented, undeniable pattern spanning nearly a year. "How long have you known?" he finally asked, his voice quieter now, some of the panic replaced by a kind of resigned shame. 6 weeks, I said again. I wanted to know everything before I said anything. I wasn't going to let you control how this ended. He tried, briefly, to turn the conversation toward blame, a common tactic, I've since learned, among people caught in long-term deception. He mentioned feeling disconnected in our marriage over the past year, implying, without quite saying it outright, that somehow my behavior had contributed to his choices. I want to address this directly, because I think it's an important point for anyone who ever finds themselves in a similar situation. Even in the exact moment of being exposed, some people will try to shift blame onto the person they betrayed, because taking full accountability is simply too uncomfortable for them to face. I didn't argue with him about our marriage in front of our friends. I simply said, calmly, "If you were unhappy, you had the option to tell me, to go to counseling with me, or to leave. Instead, you chose to lie to my face every single day for 11 months, while I planned our future and defended you to people who questioned how much time you spent at work. That's not disconnection, Daniel. That's a choice. A choice you made, over and over again, for almost a year." At this point, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from Robert. Told her. She's not denying it. This is really happening. I showed the message to Daniel, and I watched the last bit of hope drain from his face. The small, desperate hope, I think, that maybe this could somehow be contained, managed, kept quiet from the wider world. That hope disappeared the moment he understood that Melissa was facing the exact same reckoning, at the exact same time, in a completely different location, with a man who had every right to be devastated. I stood up from the table then, and I said the words I had rehearsed, in some form, for 6 weeks. I'm not doing this because I want to hurt you, Daniel. I'm doing this because I refuse to keep living inside a lie just to protect your comfort. You built this. I'm simply making sure it's seen. I asked him to leave that night, to stay with his brother, giving both of us space to process what needed to happen next. He didn't argue. I think, in that moment, some part of him understood there was nothing left to argue for. As he packed a small bag upstairs, our friends slowly, quietly began to leave, each one offering a hug, a squeeze of the hand, quiet words of support that I barely absorbed in the numb aftermath of the moment. My sister stayed behind, sitting with me at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone, long after Daniel's car had pulled out of the driveway. I didn't cry that night, strangely enough. I think I had already done my crying, privately, over the previous 6 weeks. What I felt instead, sitting at that table with my sister, was something closer to relief. The exhausted, hollowed-out relief of finally setting down a weight I had been carrying in silence for far too long. The truth was out, completely, undeniably, on my own terms. But the real work, the work of rebuilding my life afterward, was only just beginning. In the weeks that followed, I learned that exposing a lie is only the beginning of a much longer process, the process of understanding what remains once the lie is gone. Daniel moved in with his brother the same night, and over the following month, we handled the practical unraveling of 9 years together with a strange, businesslike calm that surprised both of us. There were no more screaming matches, no more late-night confrontations. Just quiet, necessary conversations about the house, our finances, and the dogs, who, in the end, stayed with me, sensing perhaps more than either of us realized about who needed them more. Word spread quickly through our friend group, as it always does, though not because I told everyone myself. I didn't need to. The people who had been at that dinner table understood exactly what they had witnessed, and in the weeks that followed, I received message after message of quiet support, along with more than a few stories from friends who admitted they'd noticed small inconsistencies in Daniel's behavior over the past year, but hadn't wanted to say anything, unsure if it was their place. I didn't hold that against them. Hindsight, I've learned, makes everyone a little more observant than they were in the moment. The professional fallout for Daniel turned out to be more significant than I expected. Melissa, it turned out, had also been involved in a minor policy violation at their company related to expense reports connected to their trips, something Robert discovered while going through shared documents during his own reckoning with her. When this came to light through an internal review at their company, not initiated by me, but a natural consequence of the scrutiny that followed once both of their personal lives became messier and more public, both Daniel and Melissa faced serious professional consequences. Daniel wasn't fired outright, but he was moved to a significantly less desirable position within the company, a demotion in every sense except the official title. I want to be clear about something here, because I think it matters. I never contacted his employer. I never tried to sabotage his career directly. The consequences he faced were the natural result of his own choices unraveling under scrutiny, not a targeted campaign of revenge on my part. My goal had never been to destroy him professionally. It had been to make sure the truth was known, completely and undeniably. What happened afterward was simply the natural weight of consequences catching up to choices he had made long before I ever found out. Robert and I stayed in touch during this period, an unexpected friendship born from an experience neither of us would have wished on anyone. He told me that his conversation with Melissa had unfolded in a similar way to mine. Initial denial, followed by a desperate attempt to minimize what had happened, followed eventually by a kind of hollow acceptance once the evidence became impossible to argue with. Their wedding, obviously, was called off. Melissa moved out of their shared apartment within 2 weeks, and the last I heard from Robert, months later, he had started slowly rebuilding his life, cautiously optimistic in a way that mirrored my own slow return to feeling like myself again. I won't pretend the months following the confrontation were easy. There were nights I lay awake in the bed we used to share, staring at the empty space beside me, feeling a grief that had nothing to do with wanting Daniel back and everything to do with mourning the future I thought I was building. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes not from missing a person, but from missing the life you believed you were living, the vacations you'd planned, the future you'd imagined, the version of yourself who trusted completely and never had reason to look over her shoulder. I went to therapy, something I probably should have considered earlier in the process, but pride and a desire to handle everything myself had kept me from it during the investigation phase. My therapist helped me understand something important. The strength it took to stay silent for 6 weeks, to gather evidence with cold precision while grieving privately, wasn't a sign that I was somehow suppressing healthy emotions. It was, in her words, a survival response to protect yourself while gathering the resources you needed to make a clear decision. Hearing that reframed something in me. I stopped seeing my own calm during that period as something slightly unsettling about myself, and started seeing it as evidence of exactly the kind of resilience I didn't know I had. About 4 months after that Sunday dinner, I ran into Daniel by chance at a grocery store, the same one, coincidentally, near where I'd sat in my car all those months earlier, deciding whether to call Robert for the first time. He looked tired in a way I hadn't seen before, older somehow, the easy confidence that had always been part of his personality noticeably dimmed. We spoke for a few minutes, mostly about logistics, the final paperwork on the house, a forwarding address for some remaining mail. Before I walked away, he said something I've thought about often since. I know I don't deserve to say this, but I am sorry. Not just for what I did, but for how I made you find out about it. You deserved better than that. I told him I appreciated him saying it, and I meant it. But I also told him something else, something I needed him to hear clearly. I'm not angry anymore, Daniel. But I want you to understand something. The version of me you lied to for 11 months doesn't exist anymore. I'm not her. And honestly, I don't think I'd want to go back to being her, even if I could. I walked away from that conversation feeling something I hadn't expected to feel that day. Not triumph, not lingering anger, but a quiet, settled sense of closure. The kind of closure that doesn't come from making someone else suffer, but from knowing you handled an impossible situation with integrity, patience, and enough self-respect to refuse living inside someone else's lie. I want to end this story not with details of what happened to Daniel or Melissa afterward, but with what I learned about myself, because I think that's the part of this story that matters most, the part that might actually be useful to you, whoever you are listening to this right now. The first lesson I learned is that silence, used deliberately, is not weakness. For most of my life, I believed that strength looked like immediate confrontation, standing up for yourself the moment you're wronged, refusing to let a single injustice go unanswered. And there is real value in that kind of strength in many situations. But I learned that there is another kind of strength, quieter and, in some ways, harder to sustain. The strength to hold your pain privately while you gather what you need to protect yourself fully. Confronting Daniel that night, I found that first message would have felt satisfying for about 5 minutes. It would have given him room to manipulate the conversation, to minimize what I'd found, to control the narrative in ways that might have kept me trapped in uncertainty for months or years afterward. My silence wasn't passive. It was the most active thing I've ever done. The second lesson is about the danger of comfortable lies. Daniel didn't wake up one day and decide to destroy our marriage. He made a series of small, comfortable choices. One message, one meeting, one secret account. Each one slightly easier than the last, because the human mind has an incredible capacity to normalize even the most significant betrayals if we take them one small step at a time. If you are someone listening to this who has found yourself taking small steps toward a betrayal of your own, I want you to hear something clearly. There is no version of a comfortable lie that doesn't eventually demand a painful reckoning. The comfort you feel in the moment is borrowed, not earned, and eventually, the debt comes due. The third lesson is about the importance of full information before making major decisions. I could have confronted Daniel with just that first message and felt somewhat justified in doing so. But by waiting, by gathering the complete picture, I was able to make decisions based on the full truth rather than a fragment of it. This mattered enormously, not just for my own clarity, but because it allowed me to help Robert as well, someone who deserved to know the truth just as much as I did, and who might never have found out otherwise, given how carefully Melissa had hidden her own tracks. The fourth lesson, and perhaps the one I think about most often, is about the difference between revenge and justice. I want to be honest with you. In the early days after discovering Daniel's betrayal, I fantasized about all kinds of dramatic revenge. I imagined confronting Melissa publicly, humiliating her in front of her co-workers. I imagined destroying Daniel's reputation, making sure everyone we knew understood exactly what kind of person he had become. But as the weeks went on, and I built my case with cold, careful precision. Something shifted in what I actually wanted. I didn't want to destroy anyone out of spite. I wanted the truth to be known, completely and undeniably, and I wanted to walk away from the situation with my integrity intact. There's a meaningful difference between wanting someone to face the truth of what they've done and wanting to cause them unnecessary suffering beyond that truth. I chose the former, and I believe, looking back, that this choice is exactly what allowed me to move forward afterward without carrying the heavy weight of guilt that often accompanies more vindictive forms of revenge. The fifth lesson is about the value of allies who share your situation, even unexpected ones. Robert became an essential part of this story, not because I sought him out for revenge, but because I understood that he deserved the truth just as much as I did, and because facing this kind of betrayal with someone who truly understood the specific pain of it made an enormous difference in how I processed everything. If you ever find yourself in a similarly painful situation, I encourage you to consider whether there might be others out there. People equally deceived, equally deserving of the truth, because facing betrayal in isolation is far harder than facing it alongside someone who understands exactly what you're going through. The sixth and final lesson is about what comes after. I want to be honest that exposing the truth didn't magically heal me. It didn't erase 9 years of memories or make the grief disappear overnight. What it did was give me back something Daniel had quietly taken from me over those 11 months without my realizing it: control over my own story. For nearly a year, I had been living inside a version of my life that wasn't real, unknowingly. The moment I chose to gather the truth, build my case, and expose it on my own terms, I took that control back. And that, more than any specific outcome for Daniel or Melissa, is what allowed me to eventually build a new life that felt, for the first time in a long time, completely and honestly my own. It's been a little over a year now since that Sunday dinner. I've moved into a smaller house, one that's entirely mine, decorated exactly the way I wanted, filled with the quiet, comfortable presence of 2 dogs who never once doubted me during any of this. I've rebuilt friendships that grew even stronger through this experience, discovered a version of myself that is more resilient, more clear-eyed, and, strangely, more at peace than I was even before I discovered the betrayal. I still think about that Tuesday night sometimes, the towel in my hand, the phone lighting up on the counter, the strange stillness that settled over me before anything else. I think about the version of myself who sat on that couch and decided, in a single quiet moment, that she was not going to let someone else's dishonesty define how her story ended. If you take one thing away from everything I've shared with you today, I hope it's this: you are allowed to take your time. You are allowed to gather the truth fully before you act. You are allowed to choose calm, deliberate strength over dramatic, immediate reaction. And most importantly, you are allowed to walk away from a lie, however comfortable it once felt, in order to build a life built entirely on the truth. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if any part of it reminded you of your own strength, your own quiet resilience through a difficult chapter of your life, I hope you carry that reminder with you. Because sometimes, the loudest, most powerful form of justice isn't the one that makes noise. It's the one that simply, quietly, and completely refuses to be silenced any longer. Before I close this out completely, I want to address a few questions I imagine some of you are asking right now, because I've had these same questions asked of me by friends and family since all of this happened. The first question people almost always ask is whether I regret waiting 6 weeks instead of confronting Daniel immediately. My answer, even now, more than a year later, remains the same: no, I don't regret it. Those 6 weeks gave me something I couldn't have gotten any other way: complete clarity, complete evidence, and complete control over how the truth came out. Confronting him in that first moment of shock would have felt satisfying briefly, but it would have handed him the exact thing he didn't deserve: the chance to manage the story on his terms instead of facing it fully on mine. The second question I get asked often is whether I felt guilty about reaching out to Robert, essentially inserting myself into a stranger's relationship. I understand why people ask this, but I want to be clear about my thinking. Robert was not a stranger to this situation. He was already deeply involved in it, simply without his knowledge. Reaching out to him wasn't inserting myself into his life uninvited. It was giving him information that directly, profoundly affected his own future. I believe firmly that anyone in that position deserves the truth, regardless of how uncomfortable the messenger's role might feel. The third question, and perhaps the one I understand the most, is whether I've forgiven Daniel. This is a complicated question, and I want to answer it honestly rather than give you the neat, satisfying answer you might expect. I don't carry active anger toward him anymore. I don't lie awake rehearsing angry conversations in my head, the way I did in the earliest months after everything happened. But forgiveness, to me, isn't about deciding that what he did was acceptable or even about needing to reach some final, peaceful resolution with him personally. Forgiveness, for me, has become simply about releasing the weight of carrying that anger forward into my new life. I don't need Daniel to understand the full impact of what he did in order for me to move forward. I've made peace with that. The fourth question people ask, especially those going through something similar right now, is simple. What should they do? And I want to be careful here, because I am not a therapist, and every situation carries its own unique complexities. But if I can offer anything from my own experience, it would be this. Trust the quiet voice inside you that notices when something feels wrong, even before you have proof. Give yourself permission to gather the full truth before making major decisions, rather than reacting purely out of the initial shock and pain. And remember that the way you choose to respond to betrayal says far more about your own character than it does about the person who betrayed you. I've received so many messages since sharing pieces of this story with people close to me. Messages from friends of friends, from people who heard secondhand versions of what happened, each one sharing their own story of quiet strength during an impossible situation. I think that's ultimately why I wanted to share this story so completely, in all its detail, rather than simplifying it into a quick, satisfying tale of revenge. Real betrayal, and real recovery from it, is rarely simple. It's slow, layered, and deeply human, filled with moments of doubt alongside moments of surprising clarity. If you're going through something similar right now, I want you to know that the quiet, patient version of strength you might be drawing on, the version that doesn't scream, doesn't rage, doesn't demand instant satisfaction, is just as valid, just as powerful as any louder reaction might be. Sometimes the most complete justice is the kind that unfolds slowly, deliberately, and entirely on your own terms. Thank you again for staying with me through this story. If you found value in it, I hope you'll carry a piece of it with you the next time life asks you to be stronger than you thought you could be.